All right, welcome to week 3 of the course. We're going to start talking specifically about the Texas Constitution, and we'll divide this into 2 parts. We'll do a little bit this week and a little bit next week, so make sure you read the assignments online. Again, it's an online text. Just click on the links that I provide under the reading questions, and you'll be brought to that particular reading assignment to be able to answer the questions that I've posted. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to pursue as objectives for this week. One, we want to understand what the purpose of a constitution is in general. Throughout the lecture today and next week, we're going to be comparing the U.S. and the Texas Constitution with one another. We want to discuss and learn some specifics about the unique characteristics of the Texas Constitution. And then we're going to go through each of the different constitutions that the area of Texas has been governed by. What were the influences of each of those constitutions and what was successful and or unsuccessful. And then lastly, how do we go about amending the Texas Constitution? All right, so I just want to say a few general things at first. And one of those things is to kind of realize that the Texas Constitution has had a great impact on the lives of Texans, as all constitutions do. It provides a basic framework for all of state and local government, including the counties that make up Texas. There's 254 counties, all the different cities. The school boards are governed by the Texas State Constitution. The water districts, even the hospital districts, are governed by the Texas State Constitution. If we think about what are some of the major influences, we can look at also the U.S. Constitution for the influences of the Texas State Constitution, as well as some of the great philosophers of classic liberalism. So, for example, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes are sometimes called the grandfather and great-grandfather of classic liberalism. And so classic liberalism is that political philosophy that argues that the primary function of government is to protect liberty while maintaining basic public order. And Texas has really taken that to heart in terms of its governing document. It started with the assumption, liberalism did, that people are by nature free and equal, and so the governments to legitimately rule have to have consent from those who are governed. And this agreement between the governed and the government, whereby the governed, the people, agree to give up some power, some independence, and some freedom, and the latter, that is, the state government, agrees to maintain public order and preserve liberty, that is called the social contract. And why would the governed agree to enter into such an agreement? Why would they agree to be ruled? Because the alternative, according to both Locke and Hobbes, is that individuals will die in what would be a life that was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's Hobbes' famous quote. And life would be like that without government to maintain order. Okay, so constitutions are reminiscent of this social contract. They're documents written by people, or more likely, their representatives that create and empower a set of political institutions. So if we think about what a constitution is, it's a legitimate state institutions, or legitimate state institutions by explaining the sources of their authority. They define the legal structure of government. They place limits on what government can do. So, for example, they delegate power, so they explain what each institution in that particular area are allowed to do. It limits the power so that the concentration of power isn't all into one governing body. And it limits the power of the state by defining rights of the citizens. And so if you look at the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution, they're very similar in the set of political institutions that they create. The legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch. So both create a republican form of government, where the people are sovereign. That means the people are the rulers. And they both create a separation of powers, where power is divided among the different branches. And each branch has the capacity to resist the power of the others. And both include a Bill of Rights. This is that limiting the power by defining the rights of the citizens. And both create what is called a federal form of government, where power is divided between a central authority and a regional government. So the federal form of government at the U.S. Constitution level is that there's a federal U.S. government and there's state governments. At the Texas state level, this federal power is that you have a state and then lots of little smaller municipalities or counties that are governing. Okay? So that's what a constitution does. But if we think about, again, the differences between the Texas and the U.S. Constitution, there still is a little bit of difference between the two. The Texas Constitution is very elaborate and long, and I'll detail that in a moment, where the U.S. Constitution is very lean and short. It's a brief document. The Texas Constitution is much longer. Okay. All right, so what is the exact role of a state constitution? If we had to think about what the state constitution's function is, how would we define that? Well, the Constitution is heavily influenced, again, by the U.S. Constitution, and I've outlined there 5 things that you can look at to see how the different constitutional experiences between the Texas and the U.S. Constitution are alike. Okay. Again, political power is derived from the people. A second similarity is that the political power is, again, divided into 3 branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. And each branch has its own powers and its own duties. And later on during the semester, we'll spend a week talking about each one of these different types of branches. Then you have a system of checks and balances that limits the power of each of the other branches so that you limit the possibility of a tyrannical government. Government cannot violate the rights of the people. This is where we have individual rights are declared in order to limit power. And then, of course, we have this idea of federalism. The idea that government is divided between a central government and a regional government. And so this Constitution is written out, which outlines the powers of the government and limitations on those powers to protect the rights of the citizens. And ideally, a Constitution should be a brief, flexible document that confers broad grants of power to the government. And then written constitutions have become the norm in more modern times, and they tend to confer or legitimate countries' governance. The government works within the boundaries of the Constitution. The legislature passes laws that don't violate the basic rules or principles outlined in the Constitution. And the more fundamental the Constitution's provisions, the less likely it will need to be updated over time. So for the example, the U.S. Constitution has lasted over 200 years, with Congress passing and repealing some laws to reflect the changing times, but basically it's held up for over 200 years, and there are 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Okay. So the U.S. Constitution has very flexible language. It remains relatively short, has been amended, as I mentioned, only 27 times. But the Texas Constitution, by contrast, is extremely long and specific. It creates a relatively weak government, something to keep in mind, and undergoes constant amendment or changes as the government tries to keep up with a rapid growing and changing state. So if we look at this graph, where the fact is that the Texas State Constitution has over 90,000 words. It's the second longest constitution of all 50 states. You can see here Alabama is the longest. Nevada is the shortest. It's much more, New Jersey is the shortest. It's much more like the U.S. Constitution. And Nevada has over almost 35,000 words, which tends to be the average. Okay, so you can see the darker the color, the more words, and you have Alabama and Texas as the longest. Okay, so that's one unique feature of the U.S. Constitution, is that it is long. And one of the reasons why it's so long is that it has been the different amendments. There are 456 amendments. And there have been an additional 176 amendments attempted by the legislature that have been vetoed by the voters. And most of the amendments are due to the document's highly restrictive nature. The Texas Constitution states that the state of Texas only has those powers explicitly granted to it. That means in today's world, in order to have any power in Texas, the Constitution has to give the state that power. So anytime something new comes up that needs to be a power given to the state, there has to be an amendment giving the state that power. Okay. And so that's one reason why it is so long. Again, it's because of the number of amendments. There are 456 amendments. Again, Alabama is leading the pack. Okay, South Carolina is the lowest. It only has 10. So there's been a long list of amendments passed to the Texas state constitution. And one of the questions that I asked you to look up when you were doing the reading is to look at what are two of the fundamental principles that the U.S. Constitution demands of the state constitutions, and that is that the state constitutions have to discuss or provide for citizen rights, that is, a Bill of Rights for the citizens, as well as provide for a Republican form of government where elections are held in order to have representatives for the people in the state of Texas. Okay, so again, the U.S. Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government, and one of the key components of the U.S. Constitution is a necessary and proper clause, which is not provided in the state constitution of Texas. All right, let's just say a few things about these different constitutions, and we'll just go chronologically. Okay, Texas constitutions, including its most current one, reflects its experience as a province of first Spain, later Mexico, then its independence, and then part of the Confederacy, and then part of the Union. So during the time that Texas was part of the Spanish Empire, its population was relatively sparse and there was no written constitution. Nevertheless, centuries of Spanish rule have left an indelible mark on Texas law. So in contrast to English common law, for example, property rights for women were well defined under Spanish law, including the right to hold property, the right to half of all property accumulated during a marriage, and the right to manage their own financial affairs. In addition, Spanish law traditionally protected a debtor's home and farming equipment from seizure of repayment of debt, and this protection has persisted throughout Texas history under the homestead provision. So unlike other states where you could go to debt for your home, you could go to jail for debts that you may owe. In Texas, we've had a homestead exemption ever since the time of the Spanish rule that protects Texans' home from being seized by the government. So the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas in 1827 is the first real constitution that ruled the people of Texas. And you can see here, this occurred after Mexico was granted independence from Spain in 1821. Texas became part of that independence from Spain. And in 1827, Texas was declared a state of Mexico combined with Coahuila. And so you can see here, I'm not sure if you're seeing the cursor or not, but this orange patch to the right above the Gulf of Mexico, this area is still part of Texas today, but this orange state was part of the country of Mexico. And so this original Mexican Constitution was very similar in structure to America's. But one big difference during this time period was Catholicism was the official religion. And remember that there is no stated state religion for the United States. The First Amendment declares that we have the right to freedom of religion. Okay. The other thing that's interesting about this particular Constitution, at the national level, the Constitution created a bicameral legislation. That means an assembly of two chambers or houses, much like the bicameral legislative branch in the U.S. government with the Senate and the House of Representatives. This Constitution also required a Supreme Court. The President and Vice President were elected by the state legislatures. There's also a Supreme Court, as I mentioned. Local affairs remained independent of the central government. So this particular state within Mexico had a lot of independence. In fact, Texans, when we think about this issue of Catholicism, Texans were required to join the Catholic Church in order to be a citizen in this particular area. So Texas was part of this particular state. The state constitution divided the state into 3 separate districts. This particular state constitution, the legislative powers were given to a unicameral body. Remember, the state of Mexico had a bicameral, the country of Mexico had a bicameral legislation, but the individual state, so think of Mexico as the United States, and this particular Coahuila, Texas, had its own governance or its own constitution. Just like if this was all the United States, this particular state has its own constitution. So in the state constitution of Coahuila y Tejas, there was a unicameral or a one-bodied legislative branch. There was an executive power was vested in a governor, so there was a governor of this particular state. They had a vice governor and they served for 4 years. There was judicial power within the state, and the Constitution guaranteed citizens the right to liberty, security, property, and equality. And there was also some constitutional language that supported efforts to curtail slavery. Okay. So that was the first Constitution. However, Texans within this region became very distrustful of centralized government, and it was Santa Anna's abolition of the Mexican Constitution and assumption of dictatorial powers which gave rise to the Texas desire for independence from Mexico. So on April 21st, 1836, Texans defeated Santa Anna and Texas gained its independence. So it becomes its own country. Okay, it becomes the Republic of Texas with the Constitution of 1836. A constitutional convention was held and delegates hurriedly wrote the Constitution. And again, this break with Mexico was a growing sense of discontent over Texas's place in the federal Mexican system. Among other things, Texas demanded more liberalized immigration policies where you had English and Spanish speaking schools. And it's interesting how this particular topic is still important today. So if we look at some of the characteristics of the Constitution, and again, this is what immigrants wanted, or the people of Texas wanted that were part of the region. They wanted to make it easier for more Americans to immigrate, languages taught in both Spanish and English, and then Texas to be its own state. So this new independence was adopted at the Washington on the Brazos, which is a city, a small town today that's on the Brazos River. And this declaration drew from John Locke's arguments about the purpose of government was to protect the rights of the citizens. Although notably one of the rights was understood to be the right to own slaves. Remember, the Mexican government was opposed to slavery, but now that Texas was independent, it wanted to make sure that one of the rights that was protected by the new Texas state government was the right to own slaves. Okay. So the Constitution of the Republic of Texas in 1836, now this is the new area of Texas. You can see it gained a lot of territory with its independence. The new Constitution set up 3 separate branches of government, modeled again on the U.S. Constitution. It was a relatively brief and flexible document providing for these 3 branches of government. It established a system of checks and balances. President was elected to a 3-year term. We had a commander-in-chief of the Texas military. A bicameral or a 2-house legislature was established. There was 1-year terms for the people that served in the House, 3-year terms for the people who served in the Senate. And there was a short legislative term. The idea was that these legislatures were going to meet for a very brief period of time, and this reflected the Texans' distrust of government in general, and this is an attitude that continues to dominate Texas politics today. At the end of the Constitution was a Declaration of Rights, which was very similar to the Bill of Rights found in the U.S. Constitution. And while white and Hispanic males were given a broad range of freedoms, free persons of African descent were prohibited from residing in the state without the consent of the Texas legislature. So slavery was allowed if you were a freed a person of African descent. You weren't allowed to live in the state unless you had consent. Okay. But there were some notable differences between this new Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. And the Texas Constitution was distinctly unitary rather than federal in nature. The Republic's Constitution prohibited priests, that is ministers, from holding office. And the most important feature of the new Constitution was its legalization of slavery, a provision that had irreversible consequences for both Texas and the United States. Immigrants moving to Texas were permitted to bring their existing slaves with them, and Texas slave owners were prohibited from freeing their slaves without the consent of the state legislature. Okay, so this is the Constitution that was put together for the Republic of Texas in 1836. All right, that's where we're going to take a break for today. We're going to pick up talking about the different state constitutions next week, so make sure you've got the reading done through the online site where the online textbook is. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and you'll find my email address on the online information under instructor information.